In the heart of ancient Rome, the city pulsed with life. Marble temples towered over crowded streets, their columns gleaming white in the Mediterranean sun. Senators in crimson-bordered togas debated inside the Senate House, while merchants shouted prices in the bustling forum. Chariots rattled across stone roads, carrying nobles to banquets where wine flowed like water. To the outside world, Rome was the height of civilization, a place of power, art, and unstoppable glory. But beneath this polished surface another world existed. It was quieter, hidden, yet just as essential to Rome's grandeur. In the shadows of temples and palaces, a darker economy thrived, the trade of human beings, and among this commerce, one group of the enslaved suffered a fate that was both troubling and largely forgotten. They were not bought for hard labour in the fields, nor trained to fight in the gladiator arenas. These were boys, taken, sold, and reshaped to serve in the private households of the elite. The Romans had a word for them, delicatus. To the people who walked the streets of the capital, a delicatus was property. To the wealthy families who bought them, they were ornaments, living symbols of refinement and power. Imagine walking into a crowded marketplace near the Tiber River. You would see boys from Greece, Syria, or Thrace standing on wooden platforms. Small placards dangled from their necks, listing their origins, their age, and the skills that made them valuable. Buyers didn't see them as children. They saw them as investments. A Roman satirist once joked that a curly-haired boy cost more than a farm. It wasn't really a joke. It was a warning. The empire's wealthiest citizens were willing to spend fortunes on these enslaved youths, showing just how deeply the system was tied to status and luxury. But what did it mean to be one of these boys? What was it like to stand in front of strangers, judged only for your appearance, then sold to a household where your life would no longer be your own? This is not just a footnote in history, it is a part of Rome's legacy that few discuss. A chapter where elegance and cruelty were inseparable, where power reached not just into politics and war, but into the bodies and lives of the most vulnerable. So today, we pull back the veil. We step inside the world of the delicatus, Rome's enslaved boys, a world that was polished in public, but terrifying in private, a world that forces us to ask, behind the splendour of Rome, how much suffering was hidden. To truly understand the lives of Rome's enslaved boys, we have to begin where their fate was decided, the markets. The Forum Boarium, near the bend of the Tiber River, was no ordinary marketplace. By day, cattle were traded there, their cries echoing against stone walls. But alongside the animals, another trade flourished, one far more chilling. Wooden platforms were built where human beings stood to be inspected, auctioned, and sold. Beneath the shadow of temples and the constant roar of Roman commerce, this was where lives were priced like goods. Here, enslaved boys were displayed before crowds of wealthy buyers. Some came straight from the empire's borders. Captives taken in war marched for weeks until they reached Rome. Others were sold by desperate families from poor provinces who gave up their children in the hope of survival. Their fates converged here, on auction blocks beside the river. Each boy wore a placard around his neck. It was a simple wooden tag, but it carried the power to define his entire life. Written on it were his origin, age, and abilities. Did he speak Greek? Could he sing or play music? Did his appearance fit the Roman ideal of refinement? Smooth skin, soft features, delicate stature. Every detail mattered, because to the Roman elite these boys weren't children. They were luxury items. Buyers walked among them, studying their posture, their faces, even their hair. Some prodded them, turned their heads to check their profiles, or forced them to smile so they could judge their teeth. The boys were told to stand still, quiet, and obedient, no matter how terrified they were. The market allowed no dignity, only display. The origins of these boys tell another story. Many were Greek, their homeland famous for culture and beauty. Others came from Thrace, known for their striking looks. Some were Phrygian or Syrian, their exotic origins adding to their perceived value. Rome's vast empire fed this trade, drawing from conquered lands and poor provinces alike. Every war, every new territory, meant more lives funneled into the markets. The Roman satirist Juvenal once remarked that a curly-haired boy costs more than a farm. It was satire, yes, but also truth. A single youth, admired for his appearance, could fetch a price higher than fertile land that could feed families for generations. Martial, another Roman writer, hinted at the same irony, mocking elites who obsessed over delicately trained slaves while ignoring the moral cost. Their words reveal the contradictions of Roman society, a civilization that celebrated philosophy, law, and virtue, yet treated human lives as ornaments to be bought and displayed. For the boys themselves, the markets were terrifying. Imagine being pulled from your home, placed on a platform in front of strangers, and knowing that your entire future depended on the glance of a wealthy Roman. Would you be bought for music, for serving wine at banquets, or for something darker? Every stare, every whispered bid decided the path ahead. The markets were efficient, cold, and routine. Buyers raised their hands to bid, prices climbed, and lives were exchanged like coin. Once purchased, the boy was led away by his new owner, often without a chance to say goodbye to anyone he had known before. There was no ceremony, no acknowledgement of humanity, only the transaction. What makes this even more striking is how public it all was. These weren't hidden practices. The auctions were held in the open, near Rome's busiest streets. Senators could pass by on their way to the Senate House. Merchants could glance at the platforms as they sold their wares. Everyone knew, and yet few questioned it. For Rome, this was simply part of life. And yet, the silence of the boys tells a different story. Their fear, their uncertainty, their complete lack of control, these are things the records rarely mention, but they are truths we can still imagine. For every wealthy buyer bragging about his new delicatus, there was a child standing on that platform, heart racing, wondering what lay ahead. The markets of Rome remind us of a cruel paradox. In a society that built aqueducts, theatres, and philosophies still admired today, human beings were reduced to objects. Rome's greatness stood on foundations of marble, yes, but also on the silent suffering of those who had no voice. When we think of ancient Rome, it is easy to picture triumphal arches and golden temples. But the Forum Boarium tells us another story. It was not just a place of trade. It was a stage where innocence was stripped away, and the value of a life was measured in coin. And this was only the beginning. For once a boy was purchased, his true life inside Rome's elite households would begin, and the cost of survival would be even greater. For the boys who left the markets with new masters, the journey into Rome's elite households marked the beginning of a very different kind of life. It wasn't freedom, it wasn't safety, it was a life built on discipline, routine, and the constant demand to serve, not as people, but as possessions. Inside these grand homes, the boys were trained from the moment they arrived. Servants and overseers drilled them in obedience. They were taught how to walk, how to stand, how to speak, or more often, how not to speak. Silence was expected unless a master asked for words. Every gesture, every movement had to reflect refinement, because in Rome's upper class, the smallest detail was a reflection of status. Their duties were many and varied. Some were assigned to grooming their masters, brushing hair and preparing perfumes. Others poured wine at banquets, standing silently at the side of a couch, ready to refill a cup at the slightest nod. Many were entertainers, taught to sing, play instruments, or recite poetry for guests. Some were even expected to memorize lines of philosophy or witty remarks, rehearsed so carefully that their words seemed natural at feasts. On the surface, these boys lived in luxury. They moved through marble halls decorated with mosaics, served meals prepared by skilled chefs, and wore fine garments chosen to match their masters' tastes. Yet beneath this appearance of comfort, there was no freedom. Their lives were not their own. Every moment was supervised. Overseers and older slaves watched closely, ensuring the boys remained obedient. A single mistake, spilling wine, speaking at the wrong time, or failing to meet the master's expectations could mean punishment. Beatings, confinement, or humiliation were common, and there was no one to intervene. Even sleep was not a refuge. Many boys slept in small chambers near their masters, available at all hours if needed. Their bodies were part of the household, always within reach, never fully their own. For Rome's elite, owning such a slave was not about necessity. It was about prestige. A delicatus was a living symbol of wealth and refinement, like a statue or a piece of art. To invite guests into a home and have them attended by beautiful, disciplined youths was a way of declaring status. These boys were expected to embody elegance, but elegance without identity. This created a strange paradox. They lived closer to power than almost anyone else. They poured wine for senators, overheard political plots, and served men whose names would echo through history. Yet despite their proximity to influence, they themselves were powerless. They could not speak freely, they could not choose, and they could not escape. Imagine standing in a candle-lit atrium surrounded by Rome's wealthiest citizens. You are holding a tray, your master's ring, glinting in the firelight as he gestures to you. You hear whispers of alliances, betrayals, and ambitions that could shake the empire. Yet none of it belongs to you. You're invisible, valued only for the grace of your presence. Writers of the time understood this contradiction. Roman poets sometimes praised the beauty and refinement of household slaves, but rarely did they speak of their suffering. Their lives were celebrated as adornments, not acknowledged as tragedies. The silence of these voices is one of history's cruelest omissions. And yet, despite the silence, we can still imagine their reality. The weight of expectation pressed on them every hour. They lived in marble palaces but carried invisible chains. Their names were forgotten, but their roles were remembered. They became part of Rome's luxury economy, an institution where domination was disguised as elegance and cruelty was hidden behind refinement. For many, the household was a gilded cage, a place where gold and marble sparkled, but freedom could never be found. To be delicatus was to live in comfort without dignity, to be admired but never respected. This was the fate of countless boys in Rome's elite homes. And for those chosen for the imperial household itself, the emperor's private sphere, the control grew even more extreme. For them, life was not just about service, it was about absolute domination, enforced through practices that crossed into the most terrifying realms of power. For the boys who entered the imperial household, the very heart of Rome's power, the rules of life were even harsher than in elite private homes. Here, service was not enough. In the emperor's palace, control had to be absolute. And to achieve that control, Rome relied on one of the most brutal practices of the ancient world, castration. The Romans had a word for these altered slaves, spadones, eunuchs who lived and worked inside the palaces of the emperors. Their presence was both practical and symbolic. To the Roman elite, eunuchs represented submission, obedience, and the ultimate display of domination over another human being. They could never father children, never build families of their own, and therefore posed no threat to the delicate balance of lineage and inheritance within the empire's most powerful circles. Yet this practice reveals one of Rome's strangest contradictions. Publicly, Roman writers scorned the idea of eunuchs. They mocked them as symbols of what they called Eastern weakness, or effeminacy, criticizing the courts of Persia and other Eastern kingdoms for employing them. But behind closed doors, the Roman elite quietly adopted the very same practice. The imperial household, with all its wealth and influence, depended on eunuchs to maintain order, secrecy, and control. It was a double standard that exposed the hypocrisy of Rome's cultural pride. Legally, castration was supposed to be forbidden. The Lex Cornelia, an old Roman law, made the act illegal. But laws in Rome did not always apply equally to all. For the poor, for criminals, or for ordinary citizens, the law was binding. For the elite, the law was flexible, bent or ignored whenever it suited their interests. And when it came to preserving the appearance and obedience of enslaved boys, enforcement was weak at best. The procedure itself was brutal. Ancient sources rarely describe it in detail, but later writers and medical accounts give us glimpses. Castration was carried out with crude instruments, without proper sanitation or anesthesia. Many boys did not survive the process. Those who did often suffered infections, fevers, or lifelong pain. There was no real medical care for them, only the demand that they continue serving their masters, no matter the cost to their health. Why would anyone endure such cruelty? The answer lies in the desires of the Roman elite. Eunuchs were prized because their altered bodies seemed to preserve traits their masters found valuable. A boy who was castrated before puberty often retained a smooth face, a softer voice, and a more delicate appearance, qualities admired in the luxury-driven culture of the imperial court. For their owners, it was not about the well-being of the enslaved, but about maintaining an image. Eunuchs were seen as eternal youths, frozen in a stage of life that appealed to their masters. There was another reason too: control. By removing the possibility of fatherhood, the Roman elite ensured that these boys could never pass on property, status, or legacy. They remained completely dependent on their masters, locked into a system where their only identity was the service they provided. It was domination taken to its most extreme form, not just the control of labour, but the control of the body itself. In Rome's palaces, eunuchs filled a variety of roles. They attended the emperor in private, managed inner chambers, and sometimes served as gatekeepers to the imperial family. They were trusted with secrets, but their trust came at the cost of their humanity. They existed in a state of permanent dependency, unable to build lives of their own, unable to escape the position forced upon them. Writers of the time reflected the unease surrounding eunuchs. Some mocked them as unnatural, others condemned the hypocrisy of the practice, but none could deny that eunuchs had become a fixture in Rome's most powerful households. They were both a tool and a symbol, proof that the empire's elite would go to any length to enforce their control. The reality, however, was far darker. For the boys who endured this fate, life was a cycle of pain and obedience. They lived in gilded halls but carried invisible wounds. They were praised for their refinement, yet stripped of the very identity that made them human. Their bodies became symbols of wealth, but also of the cruelty that wealth could hide. Rome celebrated itself as a beacon of civilization, yet in the hidden chambers of its palaces, systemic cruelty was disguised as refinement. The practice of creating eunuchs was not simply a medical procedure, it was a statement of power. It said that Rome's dominance reached so far it could reshape even the most intimate parts of a person's body. And for the boys who lived as spadens, there was no escape. Their lives were not their own. They were trapped in service to an empire that claimed greatness, while quietly enforcing some of the most terrifying practices of the ancient world. Among all the forgotten names of enslaved boys in Rome, one figure stands out in the records of history: Sporus. His story is not just a personal tragedy, it is a window into the terrifying extremes of Rome's obsession with control, image, and domination. Sporus was a young boy brought into the inner circle of Emperor Nero, one of Rome's most infamous rulers. Nero was known for extravagance, cruelty, and theatrical displays of power. But what he did with Sporus shocked even Roman society, where excess was expected and abuse was common. According to the historian Suetonius, Nero forced Sporus to undergo a physical alteration. Though the sources are vague, most scholars believe he was castrated, his body permanently changed to fit the emperor's demands. But Nero did not stop there. He dressed Sporus in women's garments, adorned him with jewels, and presented him not as a servant, but as something else entirely: his wife. In a public ceremony, Nero married Sporus, renaming him Sabina, after the emperor's deceased spouse. To onlookers, this was not an act of affection, it was a performance, a grotesque play where Sporus was stripped of identity and remade as a prop in Nero's theatre of power. Sporus appeared beside Nero in public, seated in places of honour usually reserved for high-born Roman women. He attended events, banquets, and ceremonies at the emperor's side, forced to play a role that blurred the lines between slave, spouse, and spectacle. Every appearance was a reminder that in Nero's world people were not individuals. They were instruments of display, proof of his ability to bend reality itself to his will. Historians have long debated Nero's intentions. Was this bizarre marriage an act of twisted desire, or was it pure domination? Most agree it was not love, it was theatre. By turning Sporus into Sabina, Nero staged a grotesque drama where he alone held the script. The boy was not a partner, not even truly a person. He was a character in a show designed to project Nero's power. And yet, within this cruelty, we see the most haunting part of Sporus' story: the loss of identity. His own name, his body, his future, none of it remained his. He was renamed, reshaped, and redefined, not by choice but by force. In Nero's world, Sporus became a living symbol of what it meant to be powerless. Imagine the weight of that existence. To walk through Rome's marble halls dressed as someone you were not. To be surrounded by cheering crowds who saw you not as a victim, but as entertainment. To carry the knowledge that your life had been rewritten by someone else's command. This was Sporus' reality, an existence where even his reflection in polished bronze would have been a stranger. His story survived because it was extreme, but it represents countless others whose names were never recorded. Most Delicati and Spadons left no trace in history. They lived and died in silence, remembered only as ornaments in the households of Rome's elite. Sporus, by contrast, was forced into the spotlight, but that spotlight illuminated not his humanity, only his humiliation. In the end, Sporus became more than just one boy in Nero's court. He became the emblem of ultimate loss, the proof that Rome's hunger for control could erase not only freedom, but identity itself. The tragedy of Sporus is not just about Nero's cruelty. It is about what his story reveals of Rome's culture, a world where elegance was built on suffering and power was expressed through the destruction of others. His name may be remembered, but what he lost, his body, his choice, his voice, remains a haunting reminder of what it meant to live as an enslaved boy in the empire's most powerful household. Life inside the imperial household was unlike anything else in Rome. For the Delicati who were chosen to serve the emperor and his closest circle, the palace was a world of marble corridors, perfumed chambers, and endless ritual. On the surface, it was a place of refinement. In reality, it was a theatre of control, where every moment was carefully scripted and every life tightly bound. The boys who entered this world were not left idle. They were trained from a young age to perform the arts that the Roman elite valued most. Some were taught music, playing the lyre, the flute, or singing verses of poetry. Others were drilled in recitation, memorizing the works of great writers to entertain at banquets. Many were taught to dance, their movements rehearsed again and again until they could glide across polished marble floors with the elegance expected of imperial servants. Their beauty was only part of their value. Their grace, wit, and refinement were cultivated to make them fit seamlessly into the rituals of the court. Banquets were the stage where this training came alive. In the candlelit halls of the Palatine Hill, Delicati poured wine into silver cups, offered plates of exotic foods, and recited poetry while senators and generals reclined on couches. Guests admired not only the wealth of the emperor, but the elegance of the boys who served him. Every gesture, every word was part of a performance meant to project power and culture. The same occurred in Rome's bathhouses, where Delicati attended to their masters, carrying oils, towels, and perfumes, always present, always silent. Roman writers occasionally left hints of this strange world. Martial, in his epigrams, referenced beautiful boys serving at elite feasts, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with irony. Catullus too mentioned servants whose refinement reflected the luxury of their masters. Suetonius, in his biographies of the emperors, offered glimpses of palace life, describing both the grace of Delicati and the dangers they faced if they fell out of favour. To the outside world, these boys were ornaments of elegance, but their voices were absent from history. Their names rarely survived, their lives remembered only through passing references. Beneath the surface of refinement, danger was constant. The palace was a place of political intrigue, where alliances shifted quickly and suspicion lurked in every corner. For a Delicatus, the risk was even greater. If he failed to please, if he offended his master, or if he became entangled in rumours, punishment could be swift and brutal. There were no protections, no appeals. A boy who lost favour might be beaten, imprisoned, or quietly executed. The villa of Emperor Tiberius on the island of Capri became notorious for such dangers. Ancient sources, though often coloured by political bias, reported disturbing rumours of what took place there. Suetonius and Tacitus suggested that boys brought to Capri were subjected not only to service but to humiliation and abuse. Whether these accounts were exaggerated or not, their consistency across multiple writers reveals that contemporaries saw Tiberius's villa as a symbol of excess and cruelty. For the boys who lived there, the beauty of the island could not hide the constant fear of the emperor's moods. This was the paradox of courtly life. Delicati lived in the most visible spaces of the empire. They stood beside emperors, served senators, and moved through halls where decisions shaping the world were made. They were admired for their refinement, their discipline, and their presence. Yet they themselves had no voice. They could be displayed before crowds, yet never speak for themselves. They were symbols, not people, representations of power, not individuals with lives of their own. Imagine what it meant to exist in this way, to be trained to perfection, praised for elegance, and displayed as proof of an empire's greatness, yet to remain invisible as a person, to live in a palace of marble and gold yet never be free. This was the silent tragedy of courtly life in Rome. For the delicati of the imperial household, every day was a performance, and every mistake could mean ruin. They were caught in a system where luxury concealed suffering, and where the brilliance of Rome's refinement was built on their silence. Their presence made the empire appear more polished, more divine, more eternal. But behind the ritual and the spectacle, their lives remind us of the cost. The palace may have been magnificent, but for the boys within it, magnificence was a prison. By now, it is clear that the lives of enslaved boys in Rome were not isolated tragedies. They were part of a much larger system, one that the empire itself helped to create and maintain. Rome did not merely tolerate this practice, it institutionalized it, weaving it into the very fabric of elite life. The expansion of the empire only deepened the supply. Every new conquest meant more captives. Wars in Greece, campaigns in Thrace, and the steady advance into Asia Minor and Syria brought streams of children into Roman markets. Each province added to the empire's wealth, and with that wealth came a growing appetite for luxury. Enslaved boys were a visible part of that appetite, proof that Rome's victories reached into the most personal spaces of its citizens' lives. The paradox was striking. Rome celebrated itself as a beacon of civilization. It produced philosophy, law, and literature that still shape the world today. It built aqueducts that carried water for miles, theatres that staged timeless plays, and temples that still stand in ruins as marvels of engineering. Yet at the same time, the empire built another system, one where human lives were reduced to objects of refinement. For the elite, refinement and domination were inseparable. A delicatus in the household was not simply a servant, he was a status symbol, living proof of wealth and authority. To display grace and elegance at banquets while knowing it was enforced through suffering was not seen as contradiction. It was seen as culture. Rome's greatness rested on both marble columns and invisible chains, and writers of the time occasionally hinted at this double standard. Juvenal mocked elites who spent fortunes on enslaved boys, pointing out the absurdity of valuing a child above farmland. Martial and Catullus, in their poetry, revealed the ways delicati were praised for elegance while their humanity was ignored. These voices show us that even in antiquity, some recognized the moral cost, but their words changed little. The practice remained central to Rome's luxury economy. What made the system especially cruel was the silence it demanded. The delicati had no voice. Their stories were not written down. Their suffering was hidden behind mosaics and perfumes, their lives erased even as they stood in the most visible places in the empire. Rome's history was written by senators, poets, and emperors, not by the boys who served them. The result is a narrative of greatness that rarely acknowledges the human cost, and so we are left with a question. What was Roman greatness built upon? Was it the triumphs of its legions, the brilliance of its thinkers, the beauty of its art? Or was it also the silent suffering of those who had no say, the children sold in markets, trained for obedience, and stripped of identity to serve as symbols of refinement? The truth is that both are inseparable. Rome's glory cannot be understood without its cruelty. Its temples and statues were built in the same society that turned human lives into ornaments. Its philosophies on virtue and reason were debated in households where children stood silently, ready to serve. Its greatness was never pure. It was always shadowed by the exploitation it concealed. This is the paradox of Rome. The empire gave the world legacies still admired today, but behind every achievement was a cost, often paid by those who were never remembered. And among them, the enslaved boys of the imperial household stand as one of history's most chilling reminders that the pursuit of refinement can sometimes hide the deepest forms of cruelty. We have traced the hidden lives of Rome's delicati, the enslaved boys bought not for labour or war, but for service, spectacle, and control. We have seen how they were displayed in markets, trained for elegance in elite households, and sometimes forced into even darker roles within the emperor's court. We have followed the story of Sporus, whose very identity was erased by Nero's obsession. And we have looked at eunuchs, the spadones, whose altered bodies became both symbols of wealth and tools of domination. Together, these stories reveal the side of Rome that its marble arches and golden temples never showed. A civilization admired for philosophy, law, and art also relied on systems of silent exploitation. Its greatness was built not only on conquest and culture, but also on the hidden suffering of those who had no voice. This is the paradox of Rome. The empire that gave the world aqueducts and poetry also turned human lives into ornaments of luxury. The society that debated virtue and reason in its senate reduced children to status symbols in its households. Splendor and cruelty lived side by side, inseparable, woven into the very same fabric of power. And yet this is not just a story about the past. The lives of Rome's delicati stand as a warning for today. When power goes unchecked, when image matters more than humanity, dignity is the first sacrifice. Rome institutionalized cruelty while celebrating itself as the height of civilization. The question we must ask is simple. If an empire so celebrated could hide such horror in plain sight, what illusions might our own age conceal? History is often remembered through monuments, victories, and art. But the shadows tell a different story, the story of those erased, silenced, or forgotten. The delicati remind us that behind every triumphal arch may lie a tragedy. Behind every golden mask, there may be a face forced into silence. The truth of Rome is both magnificent and monstrous. Its ruins still inspire awe, but its secrets reveal how fragile civilization can be when built on exploitation. The empire is gone, but the lesson remains. Unchecked authority can twist elegance into cruelty and turn human beings into objects of power. And perhaps the most shocking truth of all, Rome's delicati were not rare exceptions. They were part of the system, visible, refined, admired by poets and emperors alike, yet voiceless. Their silence still echoes across history, a chilling reminder that the splendor of an age can conceal horrors that only centuries later come fully into view. So when we look back at Rome and marvel at its greatness, we must also look closer, into the shadows, because history's brilliance often hides its darkest secrets.